Ontario's housing market was once the crown jewel of Canada's economy. Toronto's skyline boomed with new condos, suburban homes sold in bidding wars, and sellers promised endless growth. For years, it seemed unstoppable. But in 2025, the dream has cracked. Prices are falling, sales are stalling, and families who bought at the peak are suddenly underwater on their mortgages. What was sold as a safe investment now feels like a sinking ship. From Toronto to Hamilton to London, panic has replaced confidence. And at the center of it all stands Ontario's premier. Once proud to boast about a booming market, he now finds himself cornered by reporters, grilled by the opposition, and caught on camera losing it in frustration. Viral clips of him snapping back have become the symbol of a province in crisis. So how did Ontario go from unstoppable growth to market crashes? And is this just a correction, or the start of a crash that could rival 2008? This is the story of Ontario's housing empire, and how its collapse shook both the market and the premier himself. The Ontario housing boom. To understand the panic gripping Ontario today, we need to rewind to the years when the province's housing market wasn't just strong, it was on fire. From Toronto's condo towers to the suburban streets of the GTA, Ontario became the epicenter of Canada's real estate boom, a place where homes weren't just shelter, but tickets to wealth. The seeds of this surge were planted in the years following the 2008 global financial crisis. While the U.S. housing market collapsed, Canada largely avoided disaster. Ontario, in particular, benefited from ultra-low interest rates that made borrowing cheap and accessible. Young families who once thought homeownership was out of reach suddenly found themselves approved for massive mortgages. Investors too saw an opportunity. Bricks and mortar were safer than volatile stock markets, and Ontario real estate looked like a sure bet. Toronto quickly became the symbol of this new era. Glass condos sprouted across the downtown core, reshaping the skyline with cranes that never seemed to rest. Pre-construction units were bought up in hours, sometimes before the public even saw the sales floor. Many weren't purchased by families planning to live there, but by investors flipping contracts for fast profit. The condo market became a casino, and for years, everyone seemed to be winning. The boom wasn't confined to Toronto. As prices in the city soared, buyers spread outward. Hamilton, once known for its steel industry, was suddenly branded the Brooklyn of Toronto. Families priced out of the GTA looked westward, driving up values in cities like Kitchener, Waterloo, and London. Even smaller communities like Windsor and Peterborough felt the surge as remote work made location less important. By the late 2000s, affordability was already slipping. In Toronto, the average home cost over 8 times the median household income, one of the worst ratios in the developed world. But the frenzy didn't stop. Industry experts reassured the public that Ontario's housing market was resilient, even bulletproof. Population growth, fueled by immigration, was the constant justification. More people meant more demand, and more demand meant prices would never fall. Then came the pandemic, which acted like rocket fuel. Lockdowns and remote work changed how Canadians thought about housing. Families wanted more space, home offices and backyards, and Ontario's suburbs delivered. At the same time, interest rates dropped to historic lows, giving buyers unprecedented borrowing power. The result was chaos. Bidding wars became routine. Homes sold within days, often for hundreds of thousands above asking, and sellers practically wrote their own rules. Between 2015 and 2022, home prices in Ontario jumped more than 70%. In Toronto, detached houses that once sold for $700,000 skyrocketed to well over $1.5 million. In mid-sized cities, prices doubled in less than a decade. For homeowners, it felt like winning the lottery. For those on the outside looking in, the dream of ownership drifted further and further away. By 2022, Ontario's housing boom wasn't just an economic story, it was a cultural obsession. Dinner table conversations revolved around real estate. News outlets ran daily updates on bidding wars and record-breaking sales. Entire generations were split between those who got in early and those who were locked out. Housing wasn't just about shelter anymore, it was about status, wealth, and identity. But beneath the glossy surface of prosperity, cracks were already forming. Wages weren't keeping up with soaring prices, household debt was climbing to historic levels, and the cost of property taxes, maintenance, and insurance was creeping higher. Ontario's housing market looked unstoppable, but in reality, it was a tower built on shaky ground, and soon the foundation would start to shift. Warning signs. Before the crash, the Ontario housing boom seemed endless, but markets rarely collapse without leaving breadcrumbs of warning along the way. For years, economists, journalists, and even some cautious policymakers raised red flags, signals that the foundation beneath Ontario's housing frenzy was far weaker than it appeared. Yet, those warnings were often drowned out by the noise of bidding wars and the optimism of a public convinced that real estate only goes up. One of the clearest warning signs was household debt. By the early 2020s, Canadians carried some of the highest levels of debt in the developed world, and Ontario led the pack. Mortgages were the largest driver. Buyers weren't just stretching themselves, they were overextending, locking into loans that consumed more than half of their monthly incomes. The Bank of Canada repeatedly cautioned that such debt levels left households extremely vulnerable to even small increases in interest rates. But as long as borrowing costs remained at historic lows, the music kept playing, and few wanted to stop dancing. Another flashing red light was the disconnect between wages and home prices. Average incomes in Ontario were rising modestly, but nowhere near the breakneck pace of housing. In Toronto, the average detached home cost more than 10 times the median household income by 2021, far beyond the affordability threshold recommended by global economists. This meant that buyers weren't relying on salaries alone to purchase homes. They were relying on borrowed money, parental gifts, or speculative bets that the value of the property itself would keep climbing. Foreign investment added another layer of distortion. Ontario, and Toronto in particular, became attractive targets for global investors seeking safe havens for their wealth. Condos were bought in bulk by overseas buyers, some of whom left units empty as safety deposit boxes in the sky. This influx of capital artificially inflated demand and reduced supply for local residents. Taxes were imposed on foreign buyers, but by then, the damage was already embedded in the system. Then came inflation. By 2022, global supply chain disruptions and surging consumer prices forced the Bank of Canada into a corner. Interest rates, which had sat near zero during the pandemic, began to climb. At first, the increases were small, a quarter point here, another there, but within months the pace accelerated. For households already stretched thin, the impact was immediate. Variable-rate mortgage holders saw their monthly payments skyrocket. Fixed-rate renewals became nightmares, locking families into loans with far higher costs than they had budgeted for. Suddenly, the same debt that had once felt manageable became crushing. Construction and supply trends also hinted at trouble ahead. Ontario developers were building at breakneck speed, confident that demand would remain insatiable. Pre-construction condos sold out years before they were completed, often to investors expecting guaranteed profits. But if demand cooled or prices fell, those buyers would be left holding contracts for units worth less than what they had agreed to pay. This oversupply risk was a time bomb waiting to go off. There were also early signs of stress in consumer behavior. Mortgage brokers reported an uptick in clients asking about refinancing options just to keep afloat. Financial advisors warned that many households had no savings buffer. Their entire wealth was tied up in home equity. Even small economic shocks, job losses, unexpected medical bills, or higher utility costs were enough to push families to the brink. And yet, through all of this, optimism remained high. Local representatives continued to describe Ontario's housing market as resilient. Industry leaders insisted that immigration and population growth would sustain demand indefinitely. And ordinary Canadians, fearful of being left behind, continued to dive in, often with little consideration of the risks. The truth was clear to those willing to look. Ontario's housing market wasn't bulletproof. It was fragile, over-leveraged, and dangerously exposed to forces beyond its control. Interest rate hikes, global economic downturns, or a slowdown in population growth could all trigger a sharp correction. The warning signs weren't subtle, they were glaring. But in the frenzy of the boom, Nobody wanted to believe the music could stop. The crash unfolds. When the crash finally arrived, it didn't happen in a single dramatic collapse. It was more like a slow-motion implosion, a series of cracks spreading through Ontario's housing market until the entire structure buckled. What began as a ripple of doubt among buyers quickly escalated into panic, forcing even the Premier of Ontario to address the province's unfolding economic disaster. The first signs appeared in the suburbs. By early 2023, bidding wars, once routine, started to disappear. Homes that would have attracted 20 offers just months earlier now sat on the market for weeks, sometimes months. Sellers who expected massive windfalls were forced to lower their asking prices, often multiple times. For the first time in years, buyers held the advantage, and many chose to wait, convinced that prices would fall further. As interest rates climbed, the cracks widened. Variable rate mortgage holders saw their payments soar to unsustainable levels. Families who had purchased at the peak suddenly faced monthly bills that were thousands of dollars higher than they had budgeted. Mortgage defaults, once rare in Ontario, began to climb. Lenders reported a surge in calls from desperate homeowners seeking relief or refinancing options. The condo market, long seen as a speculative goldmine, was hit especially hard. Investors who had purchased pre-construction units at sky-high prices discovered that their properties were now worth less than what they owed. Some walked away from their deposits entirely, leaving developers scrambling to cover losses. Newly completed towers across Toronto had empty units, a stark contrast to the frenzy of just a few years earlier. In smaller cities, the downturn was even more dramatic. Hamilton, Kitchener, and London, all of which had seen double-digit growth during the boom, experienced price drops of 20 to 30% in a matter of months. Families who had stretched their finances to escape Toronto's market now found themselves underwater, owing more on their mortgages than their homes were worth. The psychological shift was as damaging as the financial one. For years, Ontarians had believed housing was a guaranteed path to wealth. Suddenly, that confidence evaporated. News headlines blared about plummeting prices, rising foreclosures, and homeowners forced to sell at losses. Social media filled with stories of young families losing everything they had put into their dream homes. The mood flipped from euphoria to despair almost overnight. The ripple effect spread quickly across the economy. Real estate agents, mortgage brokers, and construction workers all saw their industries slow dramatically. Renovation projects were canceled, furniture sales plummeted, and local businesses that thrived on housing wealth felt the pinch. Ontario's housing market wasn't just an economic sector. It was a pillar of the province's financial identity. Its collapse sent shockwaves through every corner of society. The Premier of Ontario, who had long defended the housing market as resilient, now faced mounting criticism. Press conferences grew heated as reporters pressed him on why more wasn't done to address affordability before the crash. For the first time, the Premier's usually confident tone faltered. Clips of him visibly frustrated, even losing his composure, spread across news networks and social media, becoming symbols of the crisis itself. By late 2024, Ontario's housing crash was no longer just a market correction. It was a full-blown economic emergency. Families were losing homes, savings were evaporating, and trust in leadership was crumbling. The myth of Ontario's bulletproof housing market had been shattered, and the province was only beginning to grapple with the fallout. The Premier's breaking point. At first, the Premier of Ontario tried to remain calm, insisting the downturn was temporary. But as the crash deepened, his composure began to unravel in public. The first slip came at a press conference in early 2024. When asked if he ignored affordability warnings, he snapped at reporters, accusing them of fear-mongering. The clip went viral, fueling criticism that he was defensive and out of touch. Soon after, homeowners who had bought at the peak began protesting outside Queen's Park. Families carried signs reading, "We lost everything," and "Mortgage prisoners." When the Premier met with them, the encounter turned hostile. Instead of offering sympathy, he told the crowd that markets go up and down, and that people needed to be responsible for their choices. The comment backfired instantly, sparking outrage across the province. Inside the legislature, things grew worse. Opposition leaders pressed him on why he hadn't acted sooner. Frustrated, he lost his temper, pounding his desk and shouting that no one could have predicted the crash. The outburst was replayed across news networks, painting him as overwhelmed and unstable. A televised town hall meant to repair his image only deepened the damage. When a mother tearfully described losing her home, the premier appeared impatient and dismissive. That moment, clipped, shared, and replayed millions of times, cemented the view that he was disconnected from ordinary people. By the end of 2024, the premier's breaking point had become a public spectacle. Once seen as steady and pragmatic, he was now viewed as the face of Ontario's housing collapse, angry, defensive, and losing control just when his province needed leadership the most. Beyond the headlines and economical drama, the real story of Ontario's housing collapse was written in the lives of ordinary people. Families who had stretched every dollar to buy during the peak suddenly found themselves drowning in debt. Mortgage payments doubled, equity vanished, and for many, the dream of home ownership turned into a nightmare. Across the province, for sale signs multiplied. Some families sold at a loss just to escape mounting bills, while others faced foreclosure. In cities like Hamilton and London, neighborhoods once buzzing with renovation projects now carried a quieter, heavier mood. Houses sat empty, and streets felt uncertain. Renters didn't escape the pain either. As desperate homeowners tried to cover ballooning mortgages by raising rents, tenants were squeezed. Evictions climbed, and low-income families faced homelessness at rates Ontario hadn't seen in decades. Shelters reported being overwhelmed, unable to keep up with demand. The emotional toll was devastating. Couples who had taken on risky loans reported strain and breakdowns. Parents skipped meals to keep up with payments. Children saw their homes, once a symbol of stability, ripped away. For many, the collapse wasn't just financial. It was deeply personal, shaking their sense of security and trust in the system. Meanwhile, resentment spread. Homeowners blamed politicians for failing to act, renters blamed investors for inflating prices, and younger generations blamed everyone who told them housing was a guaranteed investment. Ontario, once united in the frenzy of real estate, now felt fractured by anger and loss. In the end, the numbers told one story: billions in vanished equity, thousands of foreclosures, a shattered market. But the human toll told another. A generation scarred, dreams destroyed, and faith in leadership at an all-time low. Economic fallout. The collapse of Ontario's housing market didn't just hit families, it rippled through the entire economy. Real estate had been the backbone of Ontario's growth for over a decade, fueling construction, consumer spending, and municipal revenues. When the market faltered, that backbone suddenly cracked. Developers pulled the plug on condo projects that once promised thousands of new units. Construction sites across Toronto, Vaughan, and Mississauga slowed to a crawl, leaving cranes frozen in place and workers without jobs. The construction industry, one of Ontario's largest employers, saw layoffs surge, and with it, local economies that relied on paychecks from tradespeople and contractors began to weaken. The premier, once confident and combative, began to show cracks. Viral clips of him snapping at questions or lashing out at critics only fueled the perception of a leader losing control. Poll numbers slipped as Ontarians, both homeowners and renters, blamed him for mishandling the crisis. Investors and financial institutions also grew cautious. Banks tightened lending standards, fearing a wave of defaults. Foreign capital, once eager to park money in Toronto real estate, started flowing elsewhere. Ontario's reputation as a safe bet for investment was suddenly in question. By late 2025, it was clear. The housing collapse was no longer just a housing story. The premier wasn't just fighting to stabilize the market, he was fighting for his survival. What comes next? Ontario's housing crisis has reached a breaking point, but the future remains uncertain. Some economists argue the downturn is simply a correction, a painful but necessary reset after years of runaway growth. In their view, cooling prices could eventually restore balance, giving younger generations a chance at ownership and slowing the speculative frenzy that fueled the bubble. Others are less optimistic. They warn that the collapse could deepen, dragging the broader economy down with it. With so much of Ontario's wealth tied to housing, a prolonged slump could mean years of stagnation, rising unemployment, and shrinking municipal budgets. If insurance costs, high interest rates, and affordability challenges persist, recovery may be slower than anyone wants to admit. For the Premier, the path forward is even trickier. Public trust has been shaken, and every decision will be scrutinized. Relief programs for struggling homeowners, reforms to rein in speculation, and investments in affordable housing will all be demanded. But funding them in the middle of an economic slowdown will test the limits of government. The biggest question is whether Ontario can learn from the crash. Will policymakers finally tackle affordability with serious reforms, or will they simply wait for the next boom? Will the province diversify its economy or remain chained to a real estate cycle that rises and falls with every market swing? The choices made in the next few years will shape not just the housing market, but the entire future of Ontario's economy. The Ontario housing market was once sold as untouchable, a golden ticket to wealth and security. But in 2025, that illusion shattered. Families lost homes, investors pulled back, and the Premier himself became the face of economic failure. This is more than a story about real estate. It's a story about trust, leadership, and the dangers of building an economy on a bubble. For everyday Ontarians, the scars of this collapse will linger long after the headlines fade. As the province looks ahead, the question isn't just whether prices will recover, it's whether the people and their leaders can rebuild confidence in a system that so many feel has betrayed them. Because when the foundation cracks, it's not just homes that fall, it's hope.